So till now, whatever MVC we actually discussed in the last particular discussion, this was still very simple. Why this was very simple? Because the front end is handled by the view layer, the logic is handled by the model layer, and the controller just takes care of transferring the data here and there. Okay. Now the thing is that actually the model layer and the controller layer is taking too many responsibilities. Now, when I say taking too many responsibilities, let me give you an example. Okay. Now, let's say you try to order something, like you are talking to the waiter that, okay, I want to order this, I want to order this. You try to talk to the waiter and you tell a dish which is not available in the menu, or the restaurant is not serving that dish, right? Let's say you want to order that. Who takes care of this part? Till now, we just discussed that waiter takes the order, brings that to the kitchen, then takes the food from the kitchen, brings it back to the user. But there are more responsibilities on the waiter here. What is that? That who takes care of this validation that the request that the user is trying to initiate is not, I would say, serviceable. This dish is not serviceable. We don't prepare that dish. Like, let's say in an Italian restaurant, if let's say if at any point of time if you'll go to Italy, if you go to an Italian restaurant, there is no chance that you will find Chinese there. And technically that should happen mostly everywhere, but in India you can still find mix of Italian and Chinese a lot of places. But if you go to a very I would say uh, genuine and authentic Italian restaurant, you will find actual core Italian food there, nothing else. So they'll just say, oh, we don't serve that. Like, for example, in India, even if you go to a Italian restaurant, you will find very easily tomato ketchup and chili flakes, oregano, right, and Tabasco sauce. But if you will go to Italy and go to a very authentic Italian restaurant, they most probably 99.99% of the time they are not going to give you any chili flakes or oregano or tomato ketchup. Definitely they are not going to give, right? Because that's not what they serve. That's not actual Italian food. We have modified it here. But moral of the story is that waiter is having more responsibility, right? Similarly, in the kitchen, chef is uh, responsible for preparing the food. But who brings the raw material? Chef doesn't bring the raw material, right? There are store managers actually in the kitchen. There is one more entity that we didn't talk about. That is the store manager. What is the responsibility of this store manager? This store manager actually takes care of the raw material inside the kitchen, right? But we just said that all of the things are going to be handled by the kitchen. So there are very minor more responsibilities that people in the kitchen and this waiter is also taking care of, right? Now let me show you a code base, right? So this is a Java code base, right? Most of the time you will see Java, Python, and Node projects following this kind of a structure. Now you can see very carefully here that there is a controllers folder, definitely, but apart from that also there is a lot of things. There are a hell lot of things that are going on here. There is a utils folder, right? There is a services folder. Inside the services folder there's a bunch of things. Then there is a security folder, right? There is a repository folder, right? There is a models folder. We talked about models, but now there is a models folder here as well. There are exceptions, so on and so forth. Like, there are too many things, right? So this was a Java project. Now let me show you a Node.js project as well. Okay, so I have a Node.js project, I believe. Okay, so if I show you another Node.js project, let's say, so you can similarly see that there are a lot of things here. For example, config, controllers, middlewares, migrations, models, repositories, routes, seeders, services, utils. Lot of things are there, right? Actually, when you will go to a production level code, no, then this kind of a segregation you are going to see. This kind of a segregation you are going to see. So what's the problem with the current MVC is that there is still a lot of responsibilities that model and controller are handling, right? Even in fact, just saying that view layer handles the view is too abstract. When you actually build a React project and everything, then you will realize there are a lot of things goes on in a React project as well. There are components, there are pages, there are state management, a lot of things, right? So we don't want to talk about the view layer as of now. right? But what we are going to do is we are going to talk about a more relevant and a latest MVC architecture, right? Which will still follow a lot of things around MVC, right? But in a more granular or a segregated fashion. Okay, so there will be proper distribution of duties going on here and there. Okay, so let's see how things actually work. So let's say now technically how your code flow will work is there will be a client. This client most probably will be a, let's say, React project. Okay, inside this client what will happen is all of the, let's say, UI related code and how exactly the UI should look like and everything should be present, right? One second. Client. Okay, now what will happen is that this client is actually going to interact with the layer of backend. Okay, we already talked about the fact that okay, there will be some load balancers and everything in place, but I'm not putting that. I'm talking about actual code repository project, like with respect to a actual code perspective, how things are going to work. Okay, so our client is going to interact with our backend. Okay, to the right of this line, everything that we will draw is going to be our backend. Now, the first line of defense inside our backend, according to the MVC architecture, is what? Controller, right? This waiter, the controller. Okay. So technically, we still have that layer of controller, but that layer of controller is now a bit more segregated. Okay. That layer of controller is more segregated. How it is segregated? So let's do it like this. So let's have something like this. Okay. We need a wider one. So now what will happen is, firstly, every request will actually come to this particular part of the app. Okay, this particular part of the app. And what is this particular part? This we will call as a uber level or high level controller layer. But this high level controller layer is going to be segregated into multiple more layers. Okay, high level controller layer is going to be segregated into multiple more layers. Let's start looking at it. Okay, so the first layer that we are going to have here, just a second. Okay, so the first layer that we are going to have is going to be a layer of routing, or a routes layer, or a routing layer, whatever you want to call it. Okay, there will be a routing layer. Make sense? This is going to be a routing layer. Okay, what is the responsibility of a routing layer? Routing layer is going to have a list of routes. It will be having the URL route and the HTTP method defined, that which route is going to be triggered by a user. Okay, then this, and I'll talk more about in depth. I'll bring the whole diagram on my iPad and talk more about it. But for the timing, you can understand that the first request, I would say the first incoming request, is going to actually be tackled about this with this routing layer, because which route you want to interact with, that particular information is going to be present inside the routing layer. For example, when I do app.get and put a route, this particular part is going to be inside the routing layer. Then there is one more layer. There is one more layer. What is this layer? This one more layer, or I guess we need a more space to write it. Sorry. So let's make it like this. Let's make it like this. So let's say we have a routing layer. Okay, we have a routing layer. Then post the routing layer, we have kind of like a validator layer, and in the world of Node.js, we can also call it as middlewares. We'll talk more about middlewares, right? But the second layer that we are going to interact with, like after the request comes to the routing layer, the request will go to the validator layer or the middleware layer. I hope that point makes sense. And once we are into the validator layer and the middleware layer, then we are going to go to the controller layer. Okay, then we are actually going to go to the controller layer. So this validator is going to make request to the controller. Now, what is the role of validator? Whatever is the incoming request, we talked about the fact that the request body that a user will send might be of any shape, right? Because it can be a URL encoded or a text value or a JSON. It can be anything, right? And you might expect a bunch of things in the request body, but maybe the user is sending those parameters, or maybe the user is not sending those parameters. But let's say those parameters are mandatory for you if you want to process any request. For example, let's say there is an API in which you want to create a product. So to create a product, you need details of the product, right? Let's say the user is not sending the details of the product and is expecting you to create a product. How is that possible? So this kind of a request validation happens inside validator. So you can say request validator. Okay. So the request validator layer actually validates that whatever is the incoming request, is that following the API contract or not. If not, then it can directly revert back to the routing layer, right? If everything is good, right, we can have multiple set of validations going on. For example, let's say if the request is coming for a particular API, for example, there is a payments API. For that payment API, you need to be authenticated. So there will be a validator going on that whether the user is authenticated or not, kind of like that. And then this layer is going to send the request to the controller layer. If all the validation checks are done, then we go to the controller layer. The only responsibility of the controller layer is to call the model layer and prepare the response object. So I'll talk more about the responsibilities when I will bring it back to the iPad. So you can say that it's the responsibility of the controller layer is to take the request from validations and middleware layer, pass the request to the model part, right? And prepare the response object. All of this is the part of the controller layer. Cool. These three together contribute to the high level controller layer of the old MVC. So actually when you prepare your code, there is a routing layer, there is a middleware layer, and there is a controller layer. And I believe the project that I just showed you guys was properly depicting that as well. If you carefully see that here, see there is a controllers, there is a routes, there is a middlewares, right? Separate folder, and these are separate directory. Routing is a separate directory, middleware separate directory, controller separate directory. Then comes the big one. Okay. What is this? This is high level model layer. Okay, so in the old MVC, whatever was the model layer, this is kind of like a high level overview of that. Okay, cool. So now what happens? Now from the controller layer, once the request goes to the controller layer, then let me bring that here. Then request actually is brought into the service layer. Then the request is brought into the service layer. Okay, so technically controller from here makes a request to the service layer. Okay, so let me put an arrow here quickly. Okay, so controller actually communicates to the service layer. Okay, what is service layer? Any business logic is going to reside inside service layer. For example, if you talk about, let's say you want to prepare a Uber backend, you are preparing the backend of Uber. So there should be a logic, right? That a rider will be matched to a user. Let's say the user is requesting that I want to go from Dwarka to Rajouri Garden in Delhi. So there are a bunch of drivers. How those drivers are going to be matched to the user, that's an algorithm, right? That's a business logic. That business logic part is going to reside in the service layer. Any business logic should technically never reside inside the controller layer. Always and always business logic should go inside the service layer. Okay. Once service layer is done, then we define something called as the repository layer. Then we define something called as the repository layer. Okay, let's give it this color. And Service layer is going to communicate to the repository layer. Now, what is the responsibility of the repository layer? Responsibility of repository layer is just one thing. It will never contain business logic. So what it will contain? It will contain interfaces and methods using which you will fetch the data. Because for service layer to execute the business logic, you might need data from your data stores and databases. Somewhere your data is of all the users, all the riders, all the rides, all of this will be stored, right? So the responsibility of the repository layer is to fetch that data and give the access of that data to the service layer. Okay. That means repository layer technically will be communicating to your databases, right? We generally show a cylindrical icon for a database. Okay. So repository layer communicates with your databases. Okay. And apart from that, there is a high level model layer as well. High level model layer as well. So let's show this model layer with no, let's say this one. There is a high level model layer, just like inside the controller there is a dedicated controller layer. Inside the model layer there is one more model layer. Now what is the use of this model layer? The use of this model layer is that this model layer actually defines the programming interface of the databases. Like for example, inside the database you are storing the data of the user. So what data of the user you are storing? Email of the user, password of the user, right? ID of the user, and let's say name of the user, address of the user. These data you are actually storing in the database. Okay. This database can be anything, but for us, in order to make sure that we are able to kind of like communicate to the database, this repository layer is in direct sync with the models. These models actually represent the programming interface, like maybe a user class, because you have a user data stored in the database, right? So for us to access that data in the code, we need to have kind of like, let's say, user class that will define all the properties of the user, what is mandatory, what is not mandatory, because classes are what? Blueprint of real life entities, and our real life entity is stored inside the database. But for our code base, we are going to just interact classes and objects, right? We are just going to understand classes and objects. So those classes are going to reside inside model. So let me show you. For example, here, if you carefully see, there is a model file called as city.js. Don't worry what the code is written. Don't worry about that. Can you see here we are doing something like city has a name, right? We are just defining the interface that inside my database, how the city will look like. Inside my database, how the city will look like. Okay. Let's say you have something like airport. So inside my database, how the airport will look like. Every airport will be having a name. It will be having an airport code. It will be having an airport address, and it will belong to a city, right? So there will be a city ID. So all of these data is actually defined in the terms of classes, right? That how the data will look like, because when we will create an actual airport data will be residing inside the database, but its logical representation, or I would say the class representation, is going to be residing inside the model layer. So these four components together, or technically we should technically do one thing, that we should call database absolutely outside altogether, that these three layers together actually form the model layer, and then we have our databases, right? So this is your controller, this is your models, and these are your actual databases, right? All the business logic goes to the service layer. Every kind of a DB interaction, if let's say service has to get some data from the DB, it will never communicate directly to the DB. It will always communicate to the repository layer. How the data will be shown in the DB, or how the data will be stored in the DB, will be handled by model, that what is the representation of the data. Controller has just one job: take the request from the validator and middleware, pass it to the service, or you can say this service layer, and prepare response object. Middleware handles validation. Routing handles the details of the incoming routes and the HTTP method, that which route and HTTP method is going to be allocated to which controller and middlewares. Okay. So this actually is the actual code base level segregation. There are some extra set of folders and everything that you will find roaming around. For example, sometimes you'll find a config folder. So any kind of a configuration, let's say environment variables or any kind of a configurable data that you have, that might go inside the config folder. Okay. Then you might sometimes see a folder as utils. Utils. What resides inside utils? What resides inside utils? So any kind of, let's say, helper methods that might be reusable in multiple parts of your code. For example, converting your time into a particular format. Let's say you want to have a function that takes time in some format and converts it to some other format. This function might be reusable at multiple places in your code, wherever you have to convert time. So that is a helper method. Those helper methods actually goes inside the utils, right? So these are the set of folders that you generally maintain, right? So I've given you a high level overview. Now let's take a deep dive into these set of folders, and I'll bring all of this diagram to the iPad, and let's take a deeper dive in what is the role of each particular layer. So now let's start talking in more detail about every particular thing. So whenever the client is going to make a request, the request is going to go first to the routing layer. Now what is the responsibility of the routing layer? Okay. So this maps the HTTP method and URL route. Okay, so this technically maps the HTTP method and the URL routes that are supported by our app. Okay, whatever are the set of URLs and the corresponding HTTP methods for that particular URL we are supporting. For example, let's say we support something like a get request for /ping. So this kind of a configuration stays here. Okay. Now, based on whatever URL with a particular method you hit, based on that, routing layer forwards the request to a middleware layer. Okay. To a middleware layer. Now, what is the responsibility of the middleware layer? They validate incoming request details like request body. Okay, so inside your request body, let's say there are multiple values that are incoming, right? Let's say you want to create a product. To create a product, you might need the name of the product, category of the product, details of the product. Let's say the end user is not sending the name and the description, just sending the category. Without the name and without the description, we cannot create a product, right? These are mandatory params for creating a product. So this layer of validator is going to check for this and going to revert back that, okay, you have given a wrong, I would say, argument. Okay. So this is the responsibility of the request layer or the middleware layer, so request validator or middleware layer. If all the checks and validations are good to go, then it forwards the request to the controller layer. Now, what is the responsibility of the controller layer? This layer forwards request to service layer, take response from service layer, and prepare HTTP response object. Okay, this is the role of controller layer. Now, one thing that you have to always keep in mind, right? There should not be any business logic that should go inside controller layer. That is why a lot of time in a lot of documentation you will see that controllers should be thin. Thin means that there should not be any bloating or any too much logic should not be there in the controllers. Okay, too much logic should not go inside controllers. Any business logic, any logical thinking that, okay, bring this data, add them up, print this, print that, then subtract this, or let's say filter out these data. This kind of business logic should never reside in controller layer. All controller layer does is takes the request from here, passes the request to service layer, takes the response from the service layer, and then prepares the HTTP response object. That is the only role of controller layer. Now heading towards service layer, all the business logic goes inside service layer. For example, logic to match user and a Uber driver, right? Let's say you are making a Uber backend. So there is some algorithm that matches a user with a Uber driver. All of that algorithm goes inside the service layer. And each layer is a folder. Just keep this thing in mind. This is a folder. This is a folder. This is a folder. So, and every folder will be having multiple files, multiple files, multiple files. Okay. Then this service layer forwards the request, because now for executing business logic, this layer needs data. For executing business logic, we need data, right? That who is the user, how many drivers are nearby, all of that data this service layer needs. So this service layer do not directly communicate to the database for getting this data. Here comes repository layer. This layer is responsible to provide data to service layer. Because, and you might be thinking, why is that? Because maybe same type of data might be required in multiple services. For example, there is a service which is matching users and the riders. There is a service that is maintaining the details of the user. There is a service which shows ride history. Maybe multiple of these services which we have prepared inside the service layer need the same type of data. So we will not implement the same thing everywhere. We will keep that one method inside the repository layer, and everyone will call that repository layer method, right? So any kind of a data interaction repository layer is doing. What happens with the database? Actual data exists here. But what is model? What is models? Models give blueprint about how the data should look, in the database. They mainly have classes, right? So we prepare classes to give the blueprint, right? So this model layer generally have classes, right? This model layer generally have classes, and these classes represents how the data will look in the database, but the actual data exists in the database only, right? This is something that you have to keep in mind. Then there are two more folders. One is a config folder. These contain any configuration. For example, environment variables. That will go to the configuration folder. Then let's say you have a utils folder. What is the use case of utils folder? Any reusable helper method goes here. Any reusable helper method actually goes here. Okay, as simple as that. Now, one thing that you have to keep in mind for the repository layer, model layer, and the database part. Okay. So let's say this is repository, this is model, and this is your database. Okay. So as I said, model represents how the data looks in the database. Repository contains the logic to retrieve the data from the database. Okay. Logic for retrieving data from database. Okay. Now to retrieve the data from the database, you have to connect to the database, because database servers exist and you cannot just directly, it's not a let's say, free store that you just go and get the data. No, you have to prepare a proper connection with the database. You have to prepare a proper connection. So generally there is a TCP connection that is set up between your code base and the database, because if you carefully see here, that's why I've shown database separately. I've shown these two separately because these are not mandatory. Some people, if you have a very small project, might not even create that, but here representation of database shows that this might be separately present somewhere in some other machine also. So you need to actually connect to that database and then actually query the data, right? So in some languages and some frameworks, repository layer can directly connect to the database. Okay. In some languages and some frameworks, repository layer can directly connect to the database. So in those cases, model layer has just one responsibility to determine how the data looks in the database, right? Because it will be having all the classes and everything. So here, when we fetch the data from the database, because database, let's say, is sending the data in the form of a JSON, for example, the database sends the data in the form of a JSON. It might send the form of, it might send the data in some other form as well. I'm just assuming that, let's say, database returns the data in the JSON form. But here we cannot just play with JSONs, right? We need either actual classes or actual objects. So better is to keep actual classes. So which class this data is representing, that class detail is present inside models. But in some frameworks and languages, repositories cannot directly communicate to the database. And instead, the logic for database connection exists inside models. Logic for DB connection. That how to connect to the DB, how to set up the TCP connection, what is the DB URL on which you want to set up the TCP connection. All of that thing is generally sometimes embedded inside the model. So what repository does is, repository, instead of directly communicating to the database, it starts communicating to the model and fetch the data from the model. Now in this case, model does not just directly represent what the data will look like in the database, but will also have the interface connected to the DB. So repository calls the model and then model calls the DB, right? For example, I'll show you here. If you see this code base, if I go to repositories, let's say if I go to something like city repository, or let's go to CRUD repository. Can you see inside the CRUD repository, what we are doing? We are saying model.create, model.destroy. So this is the model layer altogether, right? This is the model layer altogether. So here in what this interface or this framework that I'm using for database connections and everything, what it is doing is that the interface, that how the database connection should actually happen, all of that is actually given by the models. So repository first communicates to the model and then things are actually working, right? This is something that you have to always and always keep in mind, right? But in some cases, this might not be true. For example, the Uber backend case that I showed you, if I go there, okay. So for example, this is a Java code. If I go to repository, now if I go to models, first of all, if you open any model, let's say car.java, this is just a normal Java class, nothing more, nothing less, okay? But if you go to repositories, so let's say we go to car repository. Now can you see car repository kind of like extends a JPA repository, right? Car repository is extending something like JPA repository, right? And what is JPA? JPA is kind of like, you can say in simple terms, it's an interface that actually connects to the DB. So you can say that the logic that connects to the DB is residing inside car repository, or I would say residing inside repository layer. Here, the use case of model layer is just to represent how the data will look like. This is just going to represent how the data will look like. But whereas for this node project, model also has the interface to connect to the database, right? Although we can, of course, like here I have used a bunch of libraries that is giving these extra capabilities to models, right? We can actually have interfaces that can, or I would say we can also set up a mechanism in which model are just classes, and instead repositories can actually directly communicate to the corresponding database. Now, one more thing that you have to keep in mind about the repository layer. Why I'm keep calling that repository layer is the one that fetches the data from the database and provides it to the service layer is because sometimes we have to write queries, that we have to write raw queries, that okay, do this, then do this, then do this, and then it will fetch the data. All of that, the raw query level data and everything also goes inside the repository layer as well. Now, when we were talking about all of these layers, one very interesting fact about repository layer that I would like to tell you, or I would say use case that I would like to tell you. Let's say initially your database, the data that you have stored is in a MySQL database. Okay. But later, let's say you migrated this database because let's say there was some issues with MySQL, were not able to scale well, and let's say you want to migrate to some other kind of a database, maybe some NoSQL database. Okay. Now, what will happen is the representation of data changed here. And not only just representation, the way to fetch the data also changed. If you won't be having a repository layer and from the service layer only you are communicating with your database, then what the problem will occur is in the business logic, where actual business logic is, you have to rewrite a lot of code to connect to the new database. And that can cause issues and bugs because business logic is very critical. Whereas if you have segregated your business logic separately and you have a repository layer, all of the logic to fetch the data from the database is inside repository layer. So you can make just changes in your repository layer and your service layer will be isolated out of it. Similar thing exists in controller layers as well. Like if you will write all of your business logic in controller layer, then what will happen? If you have to change the business logic, you have to actually change a lot of things here. But if you have your business logic segregated out in service layer, then control can remain independent and isolated. Any change here is not going to affect it here until unless you have done all the right corner cases checks and exceptions and everything. So this is also one very important reason due to which you should try to make sure that your code is as modular as possible. Think about it like this. Let's say currently, let's say inside our service layer, let's say we have a product service. What does this product service do? Let's say this product service is going to help you create a product, add a product, do a lot of things, let's say with the product. Now, let's say currently we were not having any database as of now. And let's say we were getting our products from, let's say, an online API. So there is an API called as Fake Store API. Fake Store API. So let's say all the product data we were getting from Fake Store API. So to get the data from Fake Store API, you have to make HTTP calls, right? API calls for this Fake Store API. But later, let's say now you have set up your database and your products are now inside your database as well. Now you have to change an implementation to start communicating to a database and then fetch the data. So you can see service layer will be consuming things from repository layer, and repository layer can actually change the implementation whenever it wants, right? Keeping the contract between the two layers consistent, and service layer will be isolated altogether, right? So these are some very crucial applications that you will find in this new architecture that we have actually set up.